I'm Barry, that's Rob. There is a tradition in American letters where writers are not competing with each other, but love each other, read each other's work, respect each other, and that's what you're seeing here. The difference is I'm 74 and he's 25 or something. I can't remember how we first began corresponding, but I was profoundly struck by his work and the vision, and I thought, goodness, if this man ever comes to the States, I want to host him in my world, Greater Portland, which includes Finn Rock on the northern or the upper end of the Mackenzie River. And Rebecca Solnit, whom many of you I'm sure know and read, is going to introduce Rob to a Bay Area audience in about 30 minutes, book tour. So Rob and I have been talking about this a little bit, and I would like to say some things about this book. This book is highly intelligent and beautifully managed by a writer who understands language, how to use it, how not to use it, and who understands what it is to be of service to the reader. He's been to all of these fabulous places that are complex and deep and metaphorically rich, and he offers us all of that. And I'll just let it go at that. Just a pioneering adventure into what geography means in today's world, in the shadow of global climate change, for example. So, what I did was try to go through the book and find places that would offer you a sense of the scope and the penetration. Where does this book go deep? The subtitle has to do with deep time, which could be a kind of a throwaway line because it's a popular topic. But if you will, Rob found enough about deep time to make you walk away from the book thinking about deep time and how it relates. So my first request of you is if you would read from here to the end of that paragraph.
I will. I will, just before I read this, I just want to do two things. One is I was given this object in Boston, and it is the fossilized ear bone of a whale from the Miocene. It's about 20 million years old. And this fell into my hand as a gift, and I knew immediately that I wanted it to be an auditor tonight. This is an object that listens in deep time. And I was given it by a writer called Bathsheba DeMuth, who has written an extraordinary environmental history of the Bering Strait. And she, like me, is profoundly influenced by this man sitting here. And so I thought I would just place this here as an ear from 20 million years ago that would listen in, as well as all of us, to this conversation.
What a lovely idea.
And I just have to say, because it is deep in my heart, and I've lived with it for 20 years or more now, but you will not know this, but Barry Lopez changed my life, as he has changed so many people's lives. I met his work in the late 90s, and that is the reason I am a writer. That is the reason I live the life I do now. There's absolutely no exaggeration to say that my relationship with his work is the most profound and shaping of any encounter I have had. I said to Barry that if I hadn't met Arctic Dreams in a Vancouver bookstore in 1997, I'd probably be an alcoholic solicitor in South London by now. We have never met before, though we have corresponded, and so for me tonight is a night of astonishing resonance, and there's no reason why you should feel that, but I want you to know it, that this is a hugely, hugely special encounter to me. So
Thank you.
I thank you. So now I will follow my orders, and and I will read you this paragraph. Perhaps above all, the Anthropocene compels us to think forwards in deep time, and to weigh what we will leave behind, as the landscapes we are making now will sink into strata, becoming underlands. What is the history of things to come? What will be our future fossils? As we have amplified our ability to shape the world, so we become more responsible for the long afterlives of that shaping. The Anthropocene asks of us the question memorably posed by the immunologist Jonas Salk: are we being good ancestors?
So I wanted to ask you, are we? And what does it mean? What do you mean by, what is your interpretation of what it means to be a good ancestor?
No, we are not. To be a good ancestor is not to be a good parent. Many of us are good parents. It is not to be a good grandparent. That's another order of difficulty or ease, depending on how it unfolds. To be a good ancestor is to think beyond 2 generations, into 3, into 4, into 5, into 10. And we are very bad at that. We are politically, structurally bad at it. We are imaginatively ill-constituted for that kind of forwards, responsible thinking. But as a thought experiment, as an ethic, it seems to me the question we should be asking ourselves of almost every decision we make as polities, as individuals, as communities.
One of the very attractive parts of this book is the extent to which you listen to other people and ask them about their work and then pass on the gist of it to us as readers. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Suzanne Simard, and I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about her work and why was she did she become attractive for you?
Well, this pertains to a chapter called the Understory, and in that I spend. To me, this is one of the miracles of the underworld, of the Underland. The Underland keeps its secrets fabulously well. We look up, we see trillions of miles. We look down, we see the tips of our toes. The limits of the optical are often the limits of the known. Not always, but suddenly science, led by this extraordinary female forest ecologist, opened up the black box of science, of the earth, of the Rhizosphere, and disclosed the mycorrhizal connections whereby fungal hyphae interface at a cellular level with the roots of trees, as many of you here will know, and in that way create a wood wide web, a social network of trees, as forest ecologists do not refer to it, which is an ancient mutualism. And I was drawn to this by the work of a young plant scientist called Merlin. Honestly, he's called Merlin. And honestly, he's a magician. And he you will hear a lot more of Merlin Sheldrake. Mark that name, how could you forget it? And Suzanne Simard, of course, was the person who led this field. And I was drawn profoundly by the social implications of this discovery, but also by the ways in which we project readings, we draw meanings out of this network that is fabulously, fungally, arboreally not human.
And part of what's so attractive about it is the way you introduce us to a nexus, a connection between the natural world, the so-called natural world, of which we're obviously a part, and the human cultural world. And I think one of the values of the book is that that capacity you have for integration, for saying, look, it's all metaphorical. You know, I'm speaking for you, so it's all metaphorical. So if we really think about this ear, we're launched into this metaphorical world that goes into deep time and yet is available to us in the present moment. So I was so pleased to see at how many places in the book you introduce us to something and then sort of back up and let the reader work with her own ideas with regard to deep time or communication between trees. I saw this clearly in the chapter about the invisible city of Paris, and I wonder if you'd talk about Benjamin's Calvino's Invisible Cities, but also about the Arcades project that Walter Benjamin began.
Yes, one of the many things that Barry has taught me that he does better than anyone I know, I think I've ever read, is allow matter to be itself, to be utterly itself. There is no sort of harvesting of the natural world for meaning in a way that is eventually a form of extraction and conversion. The otherness of these encounters with animals and with ice and with weather is absolutely respected. But what Barry's work has also always done for me is it rings metaphorically, and it recognizes how profoundly we make meaning, myth, story, metaphor, image out of matter. And to manage those two things is artwork, really. And so this book at least aspires to set matter ringing in certain ways. And I'm drawn to writers for whom that is the case. Calvino, the cosmic comic, a beautiful, fabulous, mystical writer for whom cities are cities but also fables. And Walter Benjamin, who, as many of you here will know, wrote the Arcades project, this great labyrinthine, catacombed warren of a work that was unfinished at the time of his probable suicide as he fled France as a Jewish man, assuming he would die if he stayed, escaped as he thought it over the Pyrenees on foot despite terrible heart problems, and was then stopped at the border and was subsequently found dead, due, it's presumed, to a morphine overdose. That there's no absolute on that. But Benjamin was a tender historian, and his tenderness was there in his telling of the, as it were, the understory of cities. The poor, the dispossessed, those for Benjamin were the people of Paris. And so he looked down to write about them because Paris has this underworld of catacombs, of cellars, of incarceration spaces. It has hundreds of miles of tunnel labyrinth where the city, in a Calvino-like way, was drawn out of itself and then built from its own underland. And in a beautiful historical detail that is nevertheless alarming to look at even from this distance, in the 1760s, the weight of the overcity collapsed into the undercity, and an entire street opened up into the underworld. And the name of that street was Rue d'Enfer, the street of hell. It's just like, that is nominative determinism at work.
And you spent a lot of time squirming your way through the catacomb country and underneath the city, and a lot of the book deals with imagining reality when your body is so constrained inside a tunnel that you're right at the edge of panic about, can I actually get through here and get out? And the thought of having to back up is impossible to consider. There were two places in the book where I thought, oh my God. Okay, just reading the sentences thinking, I don't really want to be there. I'm very claustrophobic, and you're talking about people who were claustrophilic?
Yeah, I mean, I became fascinated by claustrophobia because it does that. It causes people to back up, it causes them to shift their bodies, it changes the rate their hearts beat. And I mean this when they're reading about it, not when they're crawling through an 18-inch height.
Check on that.
Yeah, right. And I suddenly realized early on, wow, as a writer, you want to move people. That's what you do in some way. You wish to speak to their hearts and their spirits and their souls and their bodies for whatever ends. But my goodness, claustrophobia is like the main line in. You can make people dance and wriggle and jig and squirm and literally step outside so that they are not walled in. So this became fascinating to me as a vicarious power. I'm sounding like Svengali now, but all writers have a bit of Svengali in them. But there's an important edge to this, which is that I also came to think of it as actually profoundly involved with the Anthropocene discussion in this book. If there is an affect of our times, it seems to me that we are running out of time and space. That the tunnel is closing in.
Yes.
The options of movement are narrowing down. And so oddly, claustrophobia surprised me with its power as a trope, as a metaphor, as a feeling of now.
You talk at several places in the book about the there is a way in which you can go to the places that you went to, most spectacularly Greenland, the east coast of Greenland, and present a spectacular, classical, beautiful landscape that you and your companions fully engaged with, climbing and long, wonderful section about the personality of ice. And it's gorgeous. But another place you took us, into the Karst district in Slovenia, was terrifying. And the part of the underworld you allude to, cemeteries, and where we insist on getting rid of people by putting them in the cemetery, and all of these contrasts, mixed feelings we have about the underlands. You talk about the contrast between what is breathtakingly beautiful and what is heartbreakingly sad about human behavior. So I wonder if you talk about the White War.
Yes, I will. And this is, this sense of the uninnocence of landscapes and the memories they carry, the traces they record and archive of history's dark and light is what is there throughout Horizon as well. But I think the darkest chapter, ethically, humanly darkest chapter of this book is the one that takes place in the Slovenian highlands, and two conflicts moved across that karst limestone landscape. The first was in the First World War. That was the White War, as it was so called, the winter front that was ranged across the Dolomite and Julian Alps. And there, really, entire mountains were repurposed as war machines. Limestone's quite easy to work, hollow out. You get starts with it. There were field hospitals established in hillsides, gun embrasures. The mountains were honeycombed. They became part of the conflict. That was a weaponized hollow land. And then in the Second War, partisans and various forms of reprisal killings were undertaken in this karst landscape. where people were taken to the sinkholes, and the sinkholes were a means both of killing and disposal of people. And so bodies were pushed into the sinkholes, and the geology became a means of killing. And what I think intensifies that beyond just a story of atrocity is that the geology itself has reflexively produced a political history, which is to say that these sinkholes, they will not close politically. That is they are still a wound. That which was buried there keeps surfacing. If any of you know the political discussions around these so-called Foibe killings, you'll know that they are used by both sides to keep these old wounds open. And so there we move into a psychic space where trauma will not heal. It means wound, and it will not be healed.
So often in the book you're trying to get us to adopt a new perspective, I think, around, say, politics, but it's never brought up. But it's orientation toward disaster. What is your orientation if you step out of a state of denial, which is about self-preservation, and enter this underland where the best and the worst of what we are standing there together, and we have one chance maybe to turn it around. So throughout the book you're talking about our what is the line from Agamemnon, Aeschylus's about the ox?
The ox on the tongue, the watchman watching out for the flame on the horizon. And he says his life's work has been to watch for the flame on the horizon that tells that Troy has fallen.
Right.
And his only job is to see that flame and then to call out this news. But when the flame finally comes, after years of living on this rooftop, watching the horizon for news of what has happened and what is to come, he cannot speak. And Aeschylus writes, he had an ox on his tongue. And Heaney gives us this beautiful image in his translation. He said, my tongue was all swimmy, trembly with the lick of fire, slick like the gangplank of a cattle truck.
So the timeliness of this book in the wake of the disaster at Notre Dame, that's the fire, that's the collapse of Troy. And so, I was looking, I thought, for the historical perspective when I looked at that evening, like millions of other people, at the burning cathedral, and then later in the evening when it was just the floor that looked like the inside of a blast furnace, the roof was gone, the steeple had fallen, and this little drone moved over the cathedral, and you looked down into what the rubble that was left of civilization. And that's what's going on with that man who finds in the moment that he is to cry out the warning, he's speechless. And so you take that later and say, what we are facing now in the Anthropocene is the responsibility to develop a language we've never spoken before, master it, and use it to keep ourselves psychologically strong while we deal with all of these things, like global climate change. Or it was to me. I wanted to find something that's a little bit easier to deal with. Just that last paragraph. So toward the end of the book, Rob is in Norway, and there's very little Paleolithic art in the high Arctic, and one of the places where there is some is a very isolated place in the Lofoten Islands in Norway, and so he knew that there was a place where he could go and see some of this spectacular art. And I have to say, like me, I would go right away, hard though it might be to get there. So you went there, and what you were faced with was something you called the wall, that you had to go up in winter snowstorm and across in order to get to this rarely visited place. So this was when you had, you were at the very top of the climb, and you cut your way through a cornice, and it was all downhill from there. But that's what you thought.
Okay, yeah. I should say I had been watching some Game of Thrones, but the wall is actually called the wall, like before George Martin came along. It's the granite spine that runs the length of the Lofoten Islands, and they're not very tall mountains, but they are serious. And I was expecting this to be a spring crossing, which would have been fine, but winter came back with full force, and so I've just got up this ascent, and I reach up into the gap, plant the axe thunk in the frozen turf of the ridge beyond, kick up and over and through the cornice, and haul myself onto the saddle of the pass with a whoop. I lie on my back, a gaffed fish, breathing heavily, and there above me, showing through the mist, is a sea eagle, low and circling, and the queasy fear in my throat is forgotten, and my heart leaps to be overflown by that remarkable bird in that remarkable place. And then I think, it's just sizing you up as lunch. And I laugh out loud at my stupidity and the land's indifference.
One of the things that passages like that throughout the book do is let us as readers see that although you are talking about some of the most serious questions of our time, you're talking as a writer, you're talking as a teacher, you're talking as the father of 3 children, is that although these are incredibly important questions of discovery, of self-discovery and of cultural discovery, you don't take yourself that seriously, and because you don't, we believe your jubilation and your anxiety. And that means that the thing bigger than any writer, which is at the heart of a good book, is free to go with the reader wherever she or he wants to go. That's really remarkable to pull off.
Well, I have nothing to say to that, but thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, shall we have some questions or observations?
Talk some more about that chapter, which is called The Red Dancers in the book, because it's different. It's written differently than the other parts of the book. It's got a poetic quality to it that stands out in my reading of it anyway, and it's fascinating. Could you just talk about what you found there and what that means and how you sort of cycled through it multiple times to explain it?
Thank you. Yes, this is the Red Dancers, these rare figures that are painted 3 strokes on the granite wall for Sea Cave, the tip of the Lofoten Islands, proximate to the Maelstrom, this great whirlpool that gives us the generic term of the Maelstrom. It all comes from there. Edgar Allan Poe writes his famous story, The Descent into the Maelstrom, about that Maelstrom. That opens into the depths of the water. The sea cave opens into the depths of the mountain. And in that strong space, which requires at least 3 threshold crossings to reach over the wall, past the cave mouth, and then past the deepest threshold of them all, the point where light gives way to dark, there the Red Dancers were set moving 2,500, 3,000 years ago probably. And I went through this fierce and unexpected and stupid and beautiful journey to be there. And when I finally got to the point where I'd been told I would find the dancers, they were not there. They'd danced off into deep time. And I and I couldn't believe it. And then I stopped and I laid my head back against the rock, and I looked again, and there was the first of the dancers dancing out of the rock, very faintly. And as soon as I saw one, I learnt to see the others. And I wept. I cried. I was going to say like a baby, but I cried like a red dancer there. And I realized as I cried that the tears were giving movement to the dancers, and I realized that everything was giving movement to the dancers. The time, the age of the rock, the place of their making, the water that was running down that granite, the tears in my eyes. And I realized that this was a moment where the co-authoring of the world was made incredibly powerfully visible to me, in a way that we are always co-authoring. It gives the lie to whatever notion we might still hold of the single ego, the sealed human. Barry's been writing against that, and for community, and for collaboration and cooperation for as long as he's been writing.
Oh, yeah.
And that was what I read it back and I understood that was what that moment meant.
There was another reverberation in there for me, and that is how often we stop where you almost stopped, where you think of the exertion and the difficulty of your voyage to get to that cave mouth, and you go in and there's nothing. And many of us turned back at that point, but you didn't. You opened up emotionally, and when you gave in to the situation, the first answer appeared for you. And so often these kinds of lessons tell us that bleak it will be, but you have to stay with it. That's your only choice if salvation is your goal.
Reminds me of Donna Haraway's famous phrase now, staying with the trouble. Stay with the trouble. That's what we're doing right now.
Right. Somebody else, sir.
I'm a little shy to ask because it's a religious question, but can you talk a little bit about your relationship with language? Because your relationship with nature is already so profound. The way you language it, it's quite, it's dazzling to read. So I'm always wondering how you managed to do that. And I realize there are probably impressive writers, but
Thank you. Shall I repeat the question? Yeah. It was a question about language, and wonderfully, the noun language was turned into a verb as the question was asked. So I was asked how I language it, how I language the world. It's a lovely question, and I'm fascinated by rhythm. I'm fascinated by sound pattern. At the level of the sentence, at the level of even a couple of words meeting each other. And I'm fascinated by broader formal structures that move over the longer periods of reading. But I firmly believe that these forms of formal property carry out kinds of work of thinking and upon the reader that are more than propositional. So there is an I'm a teacher in my life. I love teaching. I love writing as a teacher, but there are expository sections in here, as there are in Barry's work. He's one of the great prose teachers. But I think both of us believe that there are ways of moving meaning that are to do with form, and that are to do with forms of rhythm and pattern that become discernible over small and large scales in a book. That at least is the hope, and so that I guess that's probably the thing I could say that is most interesting to me, at least, is that I work very hard at those, to a degree letting them form themselves as natural precipitates, and to a degree, to use a verb Barry used when we were talking about this earlier, intensifying that patterning.
Yeah, well, we were talking about how much of it is intentional. Is there intentionality in the structure of the sentence? and in the creation of or imitation of musical progression. How much of that is intentional, how much of it is a gift and you are a servant, you know. The late Uruguayan writer, Alberto Galeano, said once, in fact it was right here in Portland and I asked him about it, he in an essay of his called In Defense of Words, he says that he defines the writer as the servant. And so we talked about that. It was a very attractive idea to me in a culture like ours, where some people are obsessed with themselves and have an attitude toward the reader that is I know and you don't sort of thing. And I think most of the writers I admire understand that it is always the story that is important. It's not you. Your job is to understand the gift that you have been given and give us a story that helps. That's what we're doing. So we were talking tonight like two people who were all thumbs and wondering how the other guy, how did you do that? You know, and it's persistence and work and whatnot. And when you see it in somebody else's writing, you're elevated. You're thrilled because you are being shown the power of the tool that you have chosen to defend, in Galeano's phrase, and to use for good. But we both agreed that, you know, it just comes to you, and then it's your obligation to intensify it so that the reader will say, whoa, what was that about? And then the resonance with the reader, which is the important thing, that's where it starts.
This might be a little bit of a digression, but you bringing the fossilized whale here. I went to an event the other evening with our Lomi Indian Nation, and they, in addition to trying to save what they call the southern resident orcas from annihilation, you know, due to starvation and what have you, they have this movement going now to, there was a 4-year-old orca who was seized and put into the Miami Seaquarium 49 years ago. And she's been like basically in this bathtub performing all these years. And so why I'm bringing it up is when I went to hear them speak, they said that a child telepathically heard this whale say to her, "Can nobody hear me? I want to be returned to my family." Now, you know, it's a story and what have you, but it's a powerful story. Mm-hmm. And so they were saying, the Lumi were saying that people used to be able to hear the whales speak to them, and we've lost that. And so I don't know, it's probably not relevant to this at hand, except the fact that you brought that ear for that whale to be audit what we're saying. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, there's so much doom and gloom and so many endless sad stories, especially about what we're doing to animals. But I can't get that whale for 49 years in a bathtub performing. I can't get her out of my mind. And so I'm wondering, when you talk about what we're going to leave geologically, do you think, what are we going to leave geologically? What are people going to?
What we're going to leave geologically is swine bones, lead-207, which is the end of the uranium-235 decay chain, chicken bones, radionuclides, a nitrogen spike, the absence of species, the opposite of some of the great explosions of life that have happened. We're going to leave the vanishing of life. We're going to leave soil erosion. We're going to leave fly ash, and we're going to leave the rubble of our cities. Those are the future fossils among them at the moment. And at the heart of the Anthropocene thought experiment is a is a reader, and that reader is a paleogeologist who may or may not be human millions of years from now, looking back at the rock record and saying, what lived here, just as we do as geologists now? What happened in this thickness of rock? What do these strata tell us? And at the moment, that reverse reading is a grim tale. And I think that idea, that shock of the Anthropocene, that shock of the legacy question, are we being good ancestors, is a powerful one to meet. So I'm really glad you told us the story of that whale and who heard it after 49 years of not being listened to.
Yeah.
It brings a kind of darkness to consider the question that you brought up, but it is also an opportunity. It's easy to look at methane gas coming out of the tundra, or at bleaching in coral reefs, at ocean acidification, and to try to find some comfortable place to die. It's easy to do that in the great webs of denial that we weave as a culture. But the other opportunity is to face up to it in the way that historically we have always faced up to things. I'm not thinking about contemporary times, but in the record book are examples of stupendous courage and bearing and poise among people who had every reason to give up. They were starving, there was no food, and there would not be food, but still they maintained their poise and their bearing in life. And if you say, well, they died with dignity, but that was all, they missed something very important. No, they continued the history of dignity so that other women and men who wondered how could they do that would know how to do it and would not live out their lives in agony and in self-hatred. So all of these things that Rob cataloged, they're all coming. There's no way around that. The question is, what are we going to do? What are we going to do now? And the prescriptions here are learn a language, which entails learn how to speak to each other so that we don't leave each other in profound existential loneliness because we are unable to say what we can't bear. We need a language that will allow us to communicate that to each other and then discuss the really important things, which are each other's children and grandchildren and the next generation and the next. What are we going to leave them? We're going to leave them impoverished, but that doesn't mean that they will live out lives of despair. We know how to put the key in the lock and turn it, and it's just a matter of will and being a grown-up. That so many traditional people talk about the passage into adulthood is the passage that means you no longer have to be supervised. You can be trusted by all other adults to do the responsible thing. You can be entrusted with everything, and we know that you will do the right thing by us. We won't have to come in and say, you behaved irresponsibly, you got drunk and let this thing happen.
I share Barry's great respect for elders, and I count Barry as an elder. I would say a word for children and young people, though, right now, and I'm sure you would share. I mean, for me, the most exciting things that are happening are coming from young people, coming from that energy, that passion for change, that anxiety over the future, The school strikes, Greta Thunberg. I was with my daughter on the school strikes in Cambridge. We marched down the hill from the council house, hundreds and hundreds of kids. And I was marching in the main line. I suddenly realized I was invisible. I was irrelevant. They were looking right through me, and they were only looking at each other. And so I slowly moved myself out of the main line. I was an auditor. That's all. I was watching this happen, and that was thrilling to me. I wondered. We've got a few minutes. I wonder if I could just read the end of the book about children. Just there's a passage there about which sort of comes back to hope and parenthood and
High-fiving your son.
high-fiving my son. Yeah. So he's called Will, and he's that's about right. Yeah. He's got a lot of that. But I'd just come back from this nuclear waste storage facility, and I've been trying to explain, as I was saying to Barry, saying, what do you tell the children about where you've been, about darkness, about... I said, well, the one thing that really interested them was what we do with this waste that will last in its toxicity perhaps 10,000, perhaps 100,000 years. And I told them about this, about how we're trying to bury it, how we're trying to make a space and then sign that space so we can warn, so we can be good ancestors. Anyway, they're fascinated by that. Anyway, at the very last page of the book, I go to springs, where 9 springs rise near my house. This was the surfacing. Springs are amazing, aren't they? I mean, they're just beautiful, strange, magic places. Water flowing out of rock. And the water in my springs, 9 wells, 9 springs, is so clear that you have to put your finger in it to know it's water. And my son couldn't see that it was water. Lumps of white chalk lie among the ivy, glowing in the day dusk of the wood. I hug my son. A young woman appears on the path above the pool, looks down into the spring hollow and smiles on seeing us. She's walking her collie. The dog darts around barking. We talk for a little, low to high, about the springs, the wood, the weather. On her calf she has a circular tattoo of a map that shows the Arctic Circle from Canada all the way round to Greenland, as if seen from a vantage point somewhere above the North Pole. The young woman walks on, calling for her dog, which has disappeared, and my son and I talk quietly about nothing much. We feel small in the universe, and together. Later, as we're leaving, he runs on ahead down a tunnel of briar and blackthorn. The tunnel is at first in shadow, but as I watch him run, he passes into a place where the sunshine falls so brightly that he's burned up by it, lost to my sight, and suddenly the knowledge that he will die strikes me, and every leaf falls from the trees around us, and the air greys to ash, and colours utterly lost. And then life and hue pour back into the world as quickly as they were drained from it, and the leaves flicker greenly on the trees again. I run to catch up with him, calling loudly, and he turns to face me at the edge of the wood. And as I kneel down on the earth, he raises a hand in the air, fingers spread wide, and I reach my hand towards his, and I meet it palm to palm, finger to finger, his skin strange as stone against mine. And those are the last words of the book. So that was a bit of a spoiler, really. But